welcome back to our home libraries. For today's spooky season episode, we are going to be getting into Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, which is a sequel to The Shining, which we had discussed last spooky season. And anyone that joined us for that may remember that we had Carrie's, I don't remember if it was boyfriend or fiance at the time, but he was there with us. And now he's joining us again as Carrie's husband. So we're very excited to have Bradley with us. Say hi.
Hi.
And as usual, we will be spoiling this one for you. So if you have not read it or watched the movie or heard anything about it and you still want to have the opportunity, don't listen any further and then come on back when you do so. And after you have listened, please give us any sort of love you can on social media, on either Instagram, Facebook, or our YouTube channel. And as always, this is our home library, plural, because it's the two of us, or today, the three of us.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Sleep, Kayla mentioned, is the sequel to The Shining, and it follows Dan Torrance, who is now an adult. And in The Shining, he was called Danny or Doc. This book opens with Dan really struggling with alcoholism. He uses alcohol to suppress his shine, but he quickly finds a town and a people that get him into Alcoholics Anonymous. He becomes known as Dr. Sleep as he is working at a hospice and using his shine abilities to help comfort patients in their final moments. He also establishes a telepathic connection, we can call it, with a young girl named Abra Stone, who has a pretty extraordinarily powerful shine. And their peaceful existence is disturbed when a group of beings, they're not really people, beings called the True Knot, and they target children with psychic abilities and kind of feed off of their steam, which I guess is like this essence of their ability, and this prolongs their lives, so they have unnaturally long lives. Anyway, Dan and Abra, they have to confront the True Knot and protect innocent children from falling into their hands, and this leads to a pretty thrilling showdown between good and evil. So that's what happens in Dr. Sleep.
That was a good synopsis, Carrie. Yeah, a lot happens.
For some reason, it took him, 20-something years to write the second part?
Yeah, I think he kind of dreaded it. Wasn't there something in his foreword? Like Stephen King recorded the foreword because I listened on audio.
I did too.
And he said something about not wanting to come back to it, but so many people wanted it.
Yeah.
He was like, okay, I
he
guess
said
I'll do
it.
this.
Well, he also kept saying that his mind kept going to where Danny would be during his life. And he decided to finally sit down and hash it out and write another book.
Yeah.
I would imagine that there's a lot more pressure put on to a sequel. I think we all feel that way when we hype something up. So I can totally understand putting it off until he was ready. Yeah, absolutely. All in all, though, I think he did a great job with this sequel. I gave it a very high rating. What did you guys give it for a rating?
Oh, I loved it. Last time we talked about the movie kind of sucked for The Shining. The movie's actually good too. It kind of fixes why the movie sucked in The Shining.
So if you had to rate it on a scale of 5, what would you rate it?
Oh, a 5.
Okay.
What about you, Carrie?
I gave it a 3 out of 5 cats. And I had to use cats as the scale because there's a cat that lives in the hospice that Dan works at, and said cat's name is Azrael, and we just can't ignore that. So
yeah, I used cats as my...
Did you put the same reason for using cats? Is that
100%.
But I feel like we didn't really get the same chilling feeling as we did with The Shining. I really like that we get to see Dan's struggle to cope with his childhood trauma, because I would imagine that his time in the hotel was super traumatizing. And I feel like that struggle makes him a relatable character for a lot of people. But I also feel like the True Knot was really underdeveloped, even though the one scene that we have of them preying on a child is pretty heart-wrenching. I don't really think they were that menacing.
Which Carrie said that bothered you.
Oh, yeah. So I will get into that. I gave it a 4 out of 5 cats. Again, I don't think it had as much of like the spook, the chill factor as The Shining did, but I do think it's a great book and I really enjoyed it. That scene where they killed the baseball boy was the most horrific page I've ever read. And this is a testament to Stephen King because he's such a good writer, but within literally 2 sentences in that book, or that portion, like, still haunt me. Like, I still think about it, where he's like, I thought you said you weren't going to hurt me. And then it's about him like screaming, and then he finally whispers, please just kill me. I can't stop thinking about it. I actually almost did not finish this book because of that chapter. I had to have Carrie, like, she read through all of it or listened to it and like let me know a couple spots, like, hey, maybe just like when you get to this part, skip. It really bugged me. It still makes me like super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, there's one part where Dan goes back to the site where the baseball boy was killed to find his glove so that Abra can try to find the true knot and know where they are. So I let Kayla know, it's not super important to the plot. Maybe skip it if you don't want to read anything about it.
And I did. Because there's just nothing that I can think of worse than like hurting and harming innocent children, and that was what the True Knot did. So like in regards to them being a villain, they are like the worst villain, and it left me feeling really unsettled. I hated it actually.
All right, so getting into the questions, the ones we're discussing today come from a reading group guide on Bookswarm, and as always we have linked that in the description for this episode. But to get started, why do you think that Stephen King begins Dr. Sleep with a flashback to the destruction of the Overlook Hotel?
I feel like the Overlook Hotel is kind of where all this started for Danny, and then ultimately we see like the cyclical nature where then the Dr. Sleep ends kind of back at the same location. So I feel like introducing the Outlook Hotel again was vital to starting this. You guys are so cute. If anyone's watching on YouTube, Carrie and Bradley are adorable.
We also know that Stephen King hated the movie adaptation of The Shining, which did not portray the boiler explosion that we see at the end of the book. So I kind of think that he uses this scene as a reminder of what really happened at the end of The Shining, so that for those who just saw the movie, like, they know it didn't happen like that.
I'm going to wait till the second question is asked before I answer the first one.
Okay.
Because it plays a big part in my answer.
Okay. All right.
Totally fair. Then you're going to kick us off for the second question, which is...
Read the question.
The first ghost we encounter in Dr. Sleep is Mrs. Massey. She was that monstrous dead woman from room 217 in The Shining. And this haunting is not just a vision, it's extremely physical. Why do you think Stephen King decided to resurrect this particular ghost, and how does this haunting foreshadow what's to come?
Well, so the end of the book, the Overlook blows up. All the evil is trapped inside the house. Well, the evil doesn't die there. It follows Danny with him. I think that the ghosts in The Shining were people who did shine, who visited the Overlook. That's why their soul's trapped around, because at some point you see Dick, after he's passed, come back into the picture and talk to Danny.
Yeah.
So maybe The Shining can get you to linger around in the afterlife as a ghost.
So you don't think that the ghosts in the hotel were feeding off the shine? Like, because the running theory was that the hotel is kind of like the True Knot, that the Overlook was feeding off the shine, and that's kind of what fed the haunting.
Right. Well, I mean, in The Shining, they mentioned something about, I think Dick tells Danny, this place is not good for our people. Because it kind of, like, brings more out of it, if that makes sense.
Well, and Bradley, I feel like that's a really interesting point, and I feel like the True Knot, all of those members had some sort of shine to them to begin with. So that very well could be the case that you, like you said, that the like ghosts or the ghosty people from the Overlook all had a shine at some point, and that maybe that was kind of like the almost like the first version of the True Knot, where they had passed on, but they're trying to like stay around longer, and that's why they feed off the shine. And then the True Knot is like the stronger version of how they realize like, ooh, we can stop before we die and like feed off of it.
Yeah.
Right.
So I could see that.
Yeah,
Very
but why Mrs. Massey versus like we had Horace Derwent? Like there were tons of kind of memorable aspects of the Overlook Hotel. Why Mrs. Massey specifically?
I mean, that because she's in room 217.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the most iconic chapters of the book. So why not keep her around for the second one?
And I feel like that was one of the moments that, if I recall correctly, that the beings at the Overlook Hotel like physically got to Danny. Before that, it was just like things moving or him having a bad feeling about things. This was the first time it like physically manifested. So I feel like it makes sense that then in the next book that's where we see a physical manifestation again.
Right. It makes a lot of sense.
Yep. So the first time we see adult Dan, he steals money from a young woman and then leaves her toddler there, though he knows that the child is being abused because his shine, he knows these things. Authors usually want characters to be relatable. They want us to be able to identify with them. Why do you think Stephen King presents Danny in this way, and how does it then tie into the end of the novel?
Because I don't think any one is 100% good, 100% bad. So the thing about Stephen King that I like is that everything that he writes is super realistic. Even though we're dealing with, supernatural things, it's always on like this side of believability. So I feel as though he's going to maintain that for everything. And that goes with people. No one is 100% good. And we see Dan like self-medicating, which is such a common thing for how so many people. So I think it makes it real, and it really shows like the trauma that he went through, and that now he's kind of fallen into the same issues as his dad, which he never wanted to do, but he didn't know how else to cope.
Yeah. I think that this scene specifically is supposed to make Dan really relatable, because I've never personally experienced this, but you always hear about people who struggle with drugs, people who struggle with alcohol. They eventually hit rock bottom, and that is kind of what triggers them to want to do something about it. So I think that this scene is supposed to represent rock bottom for Dan, and he continues to struggle with his actions from this day, and he continues to revisit it and think about it. And I think a lot of people can relate to his actions and can see kind of his desperation to continue to feed his addiction. But really the best way that I see this tying in at the end of the novel is that somehow Rose the Hat, who is the leader of the True Knot, knows that Dan did this, and then tries to use it to antagonize him into making a mistake when they're doing their little supernatural battle thing.
Yeah, it did tie back in. I mean, again, Stephen King is a master for a reason. Like the way that he wove that back in was just amazing and heart-wrenching.
So why is it so significant that Dan sees his old friend Tony as soon as he enters the town of Frasier?
Well, Tony's in The Shining is there to warn him basically of all the danger. So I feel like him seeing Tony is like saying, hey, this is a safe space. You're finally safe. You're out of danger. Make a home here.
I said something similar, Bradley, that like Tony was almost like a spot of like comfort for him, like would warn him if there was something really dangerous, or like if he saw Tony, he knew he was going to get some information or something to help him out. And Frasier was going to be a place to help Dan out. He was able to build a network of people to help him overcome his addiction. And he needed to be there to end up ultimately helping Abra. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Bradley.
Yeah, I think that in The Shining, I don't know if we ever mentioned this last year, but Tony is Danny's future adult self. in The Shining. And I also think that Tony is a way for Dan to separate the parts of him that shine and the parts of him that don't. So Tony is the part of Dan that shines. He's the part that knows things. And here we have Tony telling Dan that, like, this is the place. And if Dan hadn't stopped in this random town for a significant amount of time, then like none of the events of this novel would have happened. This town was very important.
Yeah.
Well, it also could be a warning because at one point, doesn't Abra see Tony? That's who she originally starts making her messages to before she realizes Dan.
Well, because like I said, Tony is the part of Dan that shines. So it's not Abra contacting Dan, it's Abra's shine contacting Dan's shine. Yeah. So in a way, Abra is contacting Tony. But you could be right, because I think in the same scene where Dan gets off the bus, doesn't he see a top hat like blow down the sidewalk in the wind? And that's like supposed to be Rose the Hat's hat. Yeah. So maybe it's kind of a warning, but it's kind of also like, even though this could end up bad, this is the place that you need to be.
Mm-hmm. You're needed here.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
In what ways does the story of Dr. Sleep constantly echo The Shining? Which flashback, visions, or characters do we see repeated?
We see Dick.
That was going to be, that was my favorite tie back into The Shining, I think, was having Dick come back for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of like a psychic mentorship too. So this is how we see that continuation of that cycle. Because at one point, Dick tells Dan that when the pupil is ready, a teacher will appear. And Dick played a really significant role in helping Dan understand his shine. And then in Dr. Sleep, we see Dan kind of become a mentor for Abra. And that kind of creates this cycle. I assume one day Abra is going to have.
And I feel like it shows the cycle, and then it also shows like how we can try to make the cycle better. Like, as great as I think Dick was for Danny, they ended up losing touch, and I feel like part of that was because of Danny's like own shame for like becoming an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. But I feel like Dan then like saw some of the things that went wrong for him, and he was trying to then help Abra with that, because we see like at the end where he kind of like addresses her temper and the fact that she did like, you know, sneak a drink with her friends. Like, he just brought it to her attention, not in a forceful way, but like, listen, we are kind of along this, they end up being related, we find out. And so I don't want you to slip into some of these things. I just want you to be aware so you can try to do better. So I love that it was cyclical, but I also love that it's about trying to make the next cycle even better than, you know, what was good for Danny.
Yeah, improving. Mm-hmm. What ways do you see that Dr. Sleep diverges from The Shining? I personally think that we have a lot more variation in setting. That's like the biggest way that I see divergence, because in The Shining we have basically one setting. It's the Overlook Hotel, and that's all we get. Right. Whereas with Dr. Sleep, we get a lot more variation, different towns. He starts in Wilmington, North Carolina, for any of you who are listening from North Carolina. Mm-hmm. He starts in Wilmington. Ooh. He ends up in Fraser up north. We end up back in
Colorado.
Utah? Colorado, where the Overlook is. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And I also think that The Shining was a lot more like psychological horror, whereas Dr. Sleep feels more like a thriller to me.
I completely agree on that summation of both of them. And I feel like even though Danny was technically like battling outside forces, it felt more like internal at the Overlook, because there was no one else really to help besides
it was so isolated.
Yes. Yeah. Whereas with this one, it felt there was more of like a team. We saw like people coming together to try to help one another. Yeah. So it felt different with how they were handling the villains, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of the villain,
Rose the
Hat.
Who
is Rose the Hat? When do we first hear about her, and why is that significant?
So we touched upon it. Dan, when he got to Fraser, he saw that top hat, and he was like, this isn't real, this is the shine, like count to whatever. And then the woman that he had stolen that money from in Wilmington, she has since passed on, but she comes to Dan like through his shine and is like, you need to be careful of the woman in the hat, like stay away from her. So that was the first time we're starting to hear about this terrible being.
Mm-hmm. The first time we really see her in any significant capacity other than like warnings and omens and things is when they are in a movie theater and they're watching this girl. And if you've seen the movie, this same scene as in the movie, this girl uses the power of suggestion that she has to force her significantly older male date to go to sleep. And she
was made by Andy.
Steals his money. But like the point is, like, Rose is watching her use these powers because people who have these powers can be recruited. Like if they're too old to use their steam as sustenance, then you can recruit them and make them members of the True Knot.
Right.
And that's the first time we really see her.
And I think the book said it was, what, 1970? So
It was the
she
70s or
around
80s.
For a while.
Yeah. She was around while Dan was at the Overlook.
Right.
But once we've met both Abra and the True Knot, we see the establishment of this powerful dichotomy between good and evil. How does Stephen King create tension between these two forces?
I honestly, I described it as very much a game of cat and mouse.
Mm-hmm.
But what was really neat is that it would flip-flop back and forth between who I thought was the cat and who I thought was the mouse. Because sometimes it would feel like the True Knot had maybe the upper hand, and then we would see something from Abra or like from the people around her was like, nope, now they're messing with them. So it really kept like penduluming back and forth with like who was gonna overcome one another.
It sure did. I agree. It's also interesting because Abra and Rose established this psychic connection at one point.
Yeah.
And then they keep revisiting that connection to try to exploit one another and try to like get the upper hand. And you know, on top of that, the True Knot has absolutely zero empathy for their victims, which happen to be children. And that makes it really easy for readers to hate them. We have no empathy for what they got in the end. So.
No, none.
Even Kayla is like, no, I hate these people.
I literally, I said I almost could not finish this book because of that one scene. Like, just, oh my gosh, I've never disliked a villain more than I think in this book.
And there are a lot of books where like the villain is kind of morally gray, like they're likable in a sense, and you can understand their actions.
Right.
But this was not one of those books.
No. These
villains were not morally gray. They were terrible.
The True Knot can go straight to hell.
Literally, there was no
worst.
benefit to what they were doing except for themselves. She said that True Knot could go straight to hell.
Yeah. I've never been so upset reading about like the villain or the big bad in any sort of story. I really thought I wasn't going to be able to finish. I was like, you know what? I got as far as I could go. We'll just still do the discussion. You and Bradley can like take over for the part that I didn't get to. Like that was going to be my scenario.
Kayla was ready to put it down. Yeah. She was ready to quit.
I was so upset, which also though, I'm really glad that I finished it because it's a great book.
They got what they deserve.
And they got what they deserve.
There was retribution in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
have you seen the movie?
I haven't because Bradley, honestly, I did not start liking reading, watching any sort of horror until last year. Yeah. And then after we did, gosh, what am I blanking on? The book we didn't like, but the TV show was amazing.
Oh, The Haunting of Hill House.
The Haunting of Hill House. I got my sister hooked on it and my brother-in-law. Like we binged it. So this is why it's good to try other things. But maybe now I will watch the movie.
So
when my husband is home.
I'm not gonna spoil anything for you, but the movie has a completely different ending than the end of the book.
It does.
Oh no!
Just like The Shining did.
But the movie does tie in a lot more with The Shining.
With the movie, The Shining.
Yeah, the movie, not the book.
Okay. Well, I'll think about it.
The movie fixes the movie, The Shining.
Yeah.
Okay.
The ending is fixed. It's all got to be. Anyway. So our next question, what is the relationship between the Overlook, the Bluebell Campground, and the True Knot?
They're essentially one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
The Overlook burnt down, and then like a state-run part was built on part of it, and then the campground for the Bluebell Campground was built on part of it, and the True Knot resides as like one of their frequent, they own it, so they use that campground regularly. And they're all like essentially the same. It's like they said it in the book, but like calls to like, or like evil calls to evil. And so that area was just a mecca of evil for whatever reason. I don't know how it started.
Yeah, there was some speculation that maybe the True Knot could unconsciously sense the negative psychic forces that existed in the hotel and that are drawn to the land because the knot and the hotel are the same.
Yeah.
Kind of like an unconscious thing that's happening. So Kayla kind of already spoiled this, but we eventually learn that Lucy Stone, Abra's mother, and Dan Torrance are half siblings. Did that change the way that you viewed the relationship between Dan and Abra?
It didn't change it to me because I felt like they had the Shining, which is something that like deeply connects them. Like not everyone has that, so they already understand each other on that fundamental like level. So I feel like that in itself, like if you have a shine, like you're all like your family. That's how it feels to me. Like Dick already tried to help Danny right away. Danny was going to do it to Abra. So it doesn't change how I view their relationship.
Yeah.
Well, I watched the movie first, and that's not even mentioned.
No, it's not.
So that was a nice surprise for me. I didn't know it was coming.
Yeah.
But
it does feel nice. Yeah. It's a nice relationship.
Now, she does call him Uncle Dan in the movie also.
Yeah.
But, I didn't put two and two together. I kind of just assumed.
Well, and when
you just assume
nickname.
that she's calling him Uncle Dan so that if somebody sees them together, like nobody assumes he's like a pedophile or something.
Right, which is what they kind of talked about at the beginning of the book, like before they realized this connection, when they met up for the first time. He was like, just make sure you call me your uncle. That way no one thinks this is very...
Which is interesting because like he really is her uncle. So it's funny that they would pick that to be their cover when it's true.
It ends up being true, yeah.
If that were to happen in real life, it would be like the biggest, like strangest coincidence ever.
Yeah. But I did like
uncle? Or a coincidence.
A little bit.
I did think though that it does add a little something to the story because we saw Danny's dad, Jack, was just a train wreck. He was an alcoholic. He was out partying. So like it's not surprising that he like strayed from his marriage by any means. But the fact that like a child resulted of it, and then that child had a kid that had a shine, like it just, I don't know, it's interesting.
Put the bow on top.
Yeah.
And that like Danny would have such a powerful shine as a child, and then for Abra, who is 2 generations removed from Jack, to have an even more powerful shine.
Yeah.
Just interesting quinkydinks. Too coincidental to be a coincidence, I guess.
Is what we would say.
Yeah. So by the end of Dr. Sleep, we're told that life was a wheel. Its one purpose was to turn, and it always came back to where it started. How is this reflected in the plotting of the novel?
We've talked about it. I feel like a lot of this is just, every part of it was like cyclical in nature, like the teacher to the student, the next person having more shine than you had and how that moves forward, and coming back to the Overlook Hotel. So it was just a neat way to bring everything back together.
Well, and to be honest, a lot of Stephen King's books cross over. Like if you ever read It, Dick Halloran's in It. So it's a giant wheel of story. Oh yeah, you see him for a brief second, but he's in the book. And then if you look at if you read 11/22/63,
I want to. You told me to read that one. I just haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, it's so good. So Bev and Bill are both in that, and they're the main characters in It.
Oh,
I will not be reading it.
I won't be reading it either.
Carrie's dad read Gunslinger, and that has.
Oh yeah, he said
that has Stephen King
tied into Stephen King wrote himself into a book.
Wrote himself into the book.
I mean, that's so meta. I can't even.
That's That's extremely
That's
cool,
just one
man.
more way that he can make things just on this side of not real, is by putting himself in the book.
Yeah. Incredible.
That's so
Oh.
funny. I was gonna say, I really liked during the battle, there was this little nod to Jack. It's pretty obvious that whatever was left of Jack, whether it be a ghost, whatever it was, it kind of helped Dan finish Rose off at the end there. So that was
Yeah.
also a nice little cyclical moment for Dan to be like, my dad, while he might have been like an asshole
Flawed.
dad back in the day, he did
Yeah.
try to help me here when it really matters.
Well, and
When like I could die, like I could literally die in 2 seconds, and he helped me.
yeah, and it's again like Jack didn't do enough. Dan became an alcoholic, and he's trying to do better, and then he's trying to set Abra up to do better than him. So yeah, no one's perfect.
And this question isn't written in our notes, but we got to do it because it's spooky season. What was the spookiest part of this book for you?
Well, spookiest part actually, not just disturbing because we all know what the part that disturbed me the most was, but spooky was
Yeah.
when Abra looked up and Rose the Hat was in the window. It wasn't really her, but it was like a vision. That spooked me.
What about you?
When they exhumed the body of the baseball boy.
Yeah, that was kind of creepy.
Yeah, it was just dark.
It was.
It was very dark.
That's why I told Kayla to skip it.
I did skip that.
She didn't
It-
like the murder scene. She wasn't gonna like the exhuming of the body.
It's not super scary, but at one point he describes
Oh no.
them not burying the. I'm sorry, them not burying the boy far enough, and
Yeah.
the smell
It
being
was
so
very shallow
rancid.
grave.
and
Yeah. Because
That-
the True
that was
Knot is
Disrespectful.
the True Knot is terrible.
Yeah.
And that boy's
Atrocious.
name was Brad, by the way.
It was.
I think
Brad.
the spookiest part, not because it was
It's my
scary,
boy.
because it's like, what if this could really happen? Is when, so at one point, Abra was drugged by Crow Daddy, who's one of the True Knot members. Abra was drugged, and Dan convinced her to help him turn the wheel. The wheel is like how they could switch consciousnesses. Is that a
Mhm.
word?
Yeah.
So
Conscientious.
Dan was in Abra's body. Dan's brain was in Abra's body, and Abra's brain was in Dan's body. And like Dan was talking to Crow Daddy, and like they kept saying that like his voice sounded like her, but it wasn't her.
Mm-hmm.
They were like,
It's
"What's wrong with your
creepy.
voice?" It was really creepy.
Yeah.
What if that could really happen? We say that about every Stephen King book.
Because it could.
The Institute, especially, it's like
I still haven't
this
read
could
it.
really like this could be happening right now, and we would not know it.
Absolutely.
There could be a government institution testing on psychic children, and we would not know. There are aliens. Did you guys see that on the news?
Of course,
Yes.
there are
Aliens exist.
aliens. 100%. So
What
yeah,
else is the government keeping from us?
a lot. Because society
Okay.
could not function if we knew it all.
Probably. What were you gonna say?
What I was gonna say was, have y'all had Jeff on the podcast?
Mm-mm.
We have not. We got to figure out an episode to get him on for.
I got you. You ready? Go read the terminal list.
The
I'm reading it
Terminal
right
List.
Oh, it's a military thriller.
It's a military thriller, and it
Okay.
is so good. It was written by a SEAL named Jack Carr. But
Don't you spoil anything.
It's a fictional story. There's a
Don't
Amazon.
spoil anything.
Okay, there's an Amazon Prime TV show that's got Chris Pratt as the actor,
Yeah.
and we watched it. And there's 6 books. As soon as we watched it, I went and bought the first book.
And you're really like
I have the other 2.
The show
It's
is pretty
so
good.
good.
We watched the show.
It's so good.
I guessed
Right.
the ending about 10 seconds before it happened.
Yeah, she did.
She always guesses the endings. You're too good.
Yeah,
Kate.
and ruins everything I try to watch.
But that's not nice. That's a red flag. You don't need to ruin it for him. You can keep it to yourself. Write it on
No,
a
I
piece of
can't.
paper.
I can't keep it to
I
myself.
watched Snow White the other day and she ruined it.
Bradley, we have not watched Snow White ever.
All right, Monsters Inc.
What?
No, I don't know. No.
Just making stuff
She
up
does.
now.
She ruins every movie we try
All
to
right, moving on. In our next episode, we are going to be discussing A Path of Thorns by A.G. Slater.
Still don't
I'm never
know.
sure how to say the last name. But it's like a mixture of kind of like gothic fairy tale situation going on.
But thank you everyone for joining in for this spooky episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Head over to our Instagram and leave us a cat emoji for this one, I guess, since Azzy is
in
our
honor
favorite.
of Azriel the cat.
Yeah. And let us know if there's anything else you'd like us to read and if you're enjoying spooky season so far and maybe whatever fall activities you're up to. And thanks again, everyone, for listening. We'll speak with you next time. Bye.
Bye.